My guest today has written his second book about a Newfoundland Prime Minister. This one is called Mischief in High Places, and it's all about Sir Richard Squires. It's my pleasure to welcome to the program Mr. Ted Rowe. Hi, Ted.
Hi, Karl. It's a pleasure to be here.
Nice to have you aboard. Now, tell me about Sir Richard Squires' childhood. What kind of kid was he?
Actually, I kind of liked him when I read about him as a child, and we have some information on him that comes from his own diaries that he kept as a young fellow. And his mother died when he was in infancy, when he was about a year old. So he grew up a motherless child. He had a bit of a lonely existence through his childhood. He was well looked after by extended family, but not having the nurturing of a mother, I think, had a certain kind of effect on him. So he was a bit of a loner. He was very bright and learned to read at an early age. He had an obvious intellectual ability. As he grew a little older, he and his father were very strong members of the Methodist Church in Harbour Grace, where he grew up. And it wasn't long before, as a Sunday school teacher, when he was in his early teens, he started giving lectures and doing public speaking in the church and in the Sunday school and the church gatherings. And so he showed a pretty early talent for public speaking, and of course that served him very well throughout the rest of his life. But as a child, he was smart, quiet, not very many friends, not very sociable with other children until he got into his teens, and then he kind of loosened up a bit more.
Now, he went to the famous Methodist College, went at a very key time when the headmaster was the great Robert Edwards Holloway. And it was there that just the beginnings of his interest in politics started, wasn't it?
Well, in a sense, he became more actively involved, but his father had run as a candidate in 2 elections prior to his leaving Harbour Grace. And I'm sure that had a kind of an impact on him, in the sense that the household was probably filled with political talk when his father was running in those elections in the 1890s. But when he went to a Methodist college in St. John's, the election of 1897 caught his attention, and he, in his little diary that he was keeping, which was in a scribbler, by the way, which I happened to get access to, at the back of the scribbler he had written all the candidates for all the districts in that election, and during the election itself that day, he actually went down to the polling station in St. John's East to watch the results come in. Now, it so happened that his father was a Liberal supporter, and he was likewise, I would assume, and the Liberals lost that particular election, so it could have been a more joyous occasion for him, but he obviously had quite an interest in what was happening in politics at that time.
Just out of curiosity, I've never spoken to anybody who actually saw Sir Richard Squires' handwriting. What was his handwriting like?
Very, very nice. You would be impressed by it. It was a very nice scroll. Of course, most students back then, you were judged on your handwriting to a large extent. Yes. In writing an exam, I remember even when I went to school in the 1950s, we were graded on our handwriting occasionally. So there was an incentive to be able to write in a nice, legible, attractive scroll. And
I remember being lucky enough to see one of Joey Smallwood's notebooks once when he was the barrel man. Mm-hmm. And I was struck by how beautiful his handwriting was. Absolutely gorgeous.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, Sir Richard won the Jubilee Scholarship. Tell us about the effect that had. What was the significance of winning the Jubilee Scholarship?
Well, I guess from the point of view of the effect it would have on him as an individual, I would expect that the main event, or the main impact, was that it would legitimize him as a man of high intellect. Okay? And I think that was important to him as he was going through the rest of his legal and political career, to know that he was a cut above your average Joe. And I think it would give him the confidence that he needed in order to practice law in the way that he did, which was very successfully, and to have the career of a politician the way that he did. The other thing that I would assume that it did is that it gave the public an impression of Richard Squires as way above average in terms of his intellectual ability, and that he would be seen as a smart, sharp young man, having won the Jubilee Scholarship. And I think that would have helped him out as he got into politics and as he started his law career. And in fact, there are some newspaper reports on Squires as a practitioner of law that suggests that they thought, he was a pretty sharp young fellow here. And that probably started with the fact that he won the Jubilee Scholarship.
And talk about the relationship that he had with Edward P. Morris, who was also one of our prime ministers. He became kind of a mentor to Richard Squires, didn't he?
He was the mentor to Richard Squires, both in the practice of law in Newfoundland and in the practice of politics in Newfoundland. Squires got a Bachelor of Law degree from Dalhousie University. But during the 3 years that he was there, in the summertime, he was back home. His first summer, he went to work as a law clerk with another firm. That lawyer actually then closed down his practice. So the second and third summers that he was home from Dalhousie, he had found Morris. And he could not have done better than to have attached himself to Morris, both as a successful lawyer and as a successful politician. Morris had a very successful law practice, but he had also been in politics since the 1880s, and we're talking now about the late 1890s and early 1900s when Squires came back to St. John's from Halifax. And Morris was he came from a working class background in the West End of St. John's, but he had a real sense of, he had a personality and a bonhomme about him, that made him automatically and almost instantly appeal to people when he met them. He had a running catalog of jokes that he could trot out for any occasion, very, very popular as a public speaker, and one-on-one was very congenial, and he was very, very highly liked by his constituents and by most people who knew him. Now, Squires observed all of this, and Squires did not have the same kind of bonhomme that Morris had, but he was able to put it on when he had to put it on. He wasn't that kind of character himself, but he was able to come across that way when he was in front of an audience, and I think he picked up a lot of that from Morris.
Now, it was when he became a successful young lawyer that his interest in politics really kicked off, wasn't it?
Yes, he spent quite a few years, 4 or 5 years, when he went to work with Morris first, developing his network of contacts in St. John's. And, it takes your breath away almost to read the number of organizations that he joined. Community organizations, fraternal organizations, charitable organizations. I mean, he belonged at one point to 8 or 10 different organizations, and in most of them, because of his training in law, he understood governance and how things should work, and he almost always rose up to executive positions and then to the top a post in most of those organizations. It didn't take him long to become the Grand Master of the Orange Association for Newfoundland, and then not much longer than that to become the Grand Master of the Loyal Orange Association for British North America.
And of course, these fraternal organizations were a big deal back then.
Oh, absolutely.
Today it's kind of, you wouldn't imagine that, but back then they were a very big deal.
And they formed, the Orangemen especially, formed the core of his base, if you know, when he went into politics. Most of the campaign meetings he had would be in the Orange Hall in any community when he went around campaigning, So that was really important to him. Then he first ran in politics in the 1908 election for Morris's party. Morris had been in Bond's cabinet. Morris broke off with Bond in 1906, 1907, that period, and set as an independent in the opposition. But when the 1908 election came around, Morris started his own political party called the People's Party. And one of the people that he attracted into that party was young Richard Squires.
Yes, I was going to say, it's kind of interesting that the very first party he ran with wasn't the Liberal Party.
No, and there are a couple of writings that he made to constituents or to correspondents that he would have exchange of letters with, where he tried to rewrite history a little bit, and he saw himself as a successor to Bond. Now, he wasn't, but that's how he couched it in looking back.
That would have horrified Bond, I think.
Oh, it would have, indeed. See, in the same way that Smallwood saw himself as a successor to Squires. Smallwood often said, that if you look back on the great liberals of our history, start with Whiteway, Sir Robert Bond, Sir Richard Squires, and now me. So Squires had the same kind of feeling of himself, that he was the natural successor to Bond, and he eventually became a liberal again, but when he started out first, it was through the People's Party, which was Morris's party.
Now, Ted, in his second run, he was probably shocked by this, but he actually lost. And I guess the Prime Minister appointed him to the Legislative Council, which would have been Newfoundland's Senate back in those days. But Squires was a really sore loser, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. There's no way you could say that he was a good loser. He really loved to win. He thought that he should win, and if he didn't, well, it was, it was somebody else's fault. When he lost the election of 1909, we'll go back earlier when he won one of his elections. In fact, it was the first election when he ran as Prime Minister in 1919. He heard, even though he'd won, he heard that there was a little pocket of opposition in Trinity Bay, in New Harbour, that had not supported him. And this is in his correspondence. He writes to one of his supporters out there and says, "Would you kindly let me know the names of the people who didn't support me in the election, and of any others that you might know of who are enemies to our cause?" And
wow.
He didn't want to forget them, and he wanted payback if he had a chance to do it. So there was that side of him, which was, I guess, part of his competitiveness. But man, no, he was not a good loser.
Yeah, sounds a little Nixonian almost.
Yeah.
Now, he had an early connection with or friendship with Sir William Coaker, but over the years, their relationship was kind of up and down, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. The first connection between him and Coaker, of course, being the founder of the Fishermen's Protective Union, that became a very strong force in Newfoundland politics. They were 20,000 strong, and they were a sizable and important political base. The first connection between the two of them that I found was Coaker writing Squires in 1909. He founded the FPU in 1908. The following year, Squires had a reputation as being a really sharp lawyer. And Coaker writes him and wants to know if he would represent the union and would represent any individual members that needed legal advice. Squires writes back and says, yes, I'd be pleased to represent the union. I think you're doing really important work in organizing the fishermen and other laborers. But I would not be able to give you an answer about representing individual members until I had an idea of how much work is going to be involved and what kind of work they would want me to do. So there was nothing further on that. So they made that initial contact. And then the next time that they had a relationship with each other was when Coaker was elected and with his party in 1913. And Coaker saw Squires then as one of the elites, or in his words, one of the bloodsuckers of St. John's. And when they faced each other on opposite sides of the house, I mean, they lambasted each other terribly in between 1916, 1920, that period of time. You know, I mean, they couldn't say anything good about each other, and they couldn't say anything bad enough about each other. They were really at loggerheads. Then Squires runs for Prime Minister in 1919. He starts his own political party, the Liberal Reform Party, and he sees the path to victory in the election as hooking up with Coaker and his party. And Coaker sees it as well. Squires makes the first move, contacts Coaker and says, we really need to talk about this because here's a way that we can form the government. Coaker says, yeah, okay, I guess we can talk about it, but you know, he's half-hearted about throwing in with Squires. He eventually agrees to do it, and he says to his followers, to the FPU, that he picked Squires because there was no other man available. It wasn't exactly a wholehearted endorsement of wanting to be a co-runner with Squires in the election.
Best I could find.
That's right. But Squires, they had an agreement that if they won the election, Squires would be Prime Minister, Coaker would be acting Prime Minister in his absence, and that Coaker would have charge of the fisheries portfolio. And that's really what Coaker wanted. Coaker had no interest in being Prime Minister. He was busy enough running the FPU, but he really wanted to reform the fishery. And that he had his crack at doing that when they got in power.
Ted, something I found really interesting in this book was the effect that newspapers had on elections. It was almost impossible, if you were looking for a role in leadership, it was almost impossible to get elected unless you had a newspaper doing propaganda for you.
Absolutely.
And Squires had no newspaper support at all. Oh. So he actually bought his own newspaper so that he could pump out his own propaganda with his own newspaper, didn't he?
Absolutely.
Just talk about the role of the press back in those days, because it's absolutely fascinating.
Well, it was, the newspapers were the mass media, medium, I guess, because there's only one medium back then. There was no radio. It was before radio, and certainly no TV. I mean, there was film, but nobody used film for advertising, right? So you either went and met people, you campaigned and met people face to face, one-on-one, person to person, or you used the telegraph services to get information out, or you used the newspaper. And for widespread propaganda and for widespread appeal of your message, you really had to use a newspaper. And Squires poured a lot of money, starting in 1916, for the next 3 years, getting ready to run for Prime Minister. He poured a lot of money into his newspaper called the Daily Star. In fact, it almost put him into insolvency. And we may want to get to this in a minute, but it was the reason why he looked around for how he could profit from being Prime Minister to help bail himself out of this massive backload of debt that he had encountered with the Daily Star. And it was really important to him. And if you think of, that was the way that people formed their opinions, so not of the news, but of what was going on in politics. And with the proper editor of a newspaper who was always on your side and promoting you as, the best thing since sliced bread in politics, that was important. But also the way that the news was reported by a paper, the way that the news of political rallies came out, how that was couched, was not very often was it done in a neutral kind of way. It was done favoring one or favoring the other. And the existing newspapers, the reason he bought his own is that the existing newspapers, there were three main ones in St. John's. The Fisherman's Advocate, which was Coaker's, the Union newspaper. The Evening Telegram, which is still the Telegram today, and the Daily News, which was the morning paper. And the Evening Telegram and the Daily News had not much use for Squires. They saw him as an upstart, and just a guy who just thought too much about himself. He really didn't engender a lot of respect amongst the establishment in St. John's. He worked very hard to get it, but he never did get it from some of them. And the newspaper editors were part of the elite class in St. John's. The Daily News said, the editor of the Daily News said, when Squires formed his political party to get ready to run in the 1919 election, the news on Mr. Squires' party was met in St. John's with an amusing smile. And when I say
exactly
there is no way that he's ever going to win an election. Well, I mean, he proved him wrong because he certainly did win it, along with Coaker. But the power of the press was really, really significant, as you say. Squires was worried when his paper didn't get out on time. He was worried, and at one point he accused the Postal Service, which was the government Newfoundland Postal Service at the time, of delaying distribution of his newspaper to the outports. Then he had delays in getting newsprint in from Grand Falls, and he accused the A&D company of trying to undermine him by not giving him enough newsprint to print his paper. I mean, he did realize the importance and the power of the press, and was very taken up with it.
Now, his ethics were often in question. In your book, you talk about how he was on a committee that was arbitrating a dispute between the Reed Company and the Newfoundland government. And he took $5,000 from the Reed Company while he was involved in this arbitration.
Yes, that was the first thing. And boy, Coaker took that and nailed him on that time and time and time again. And everybody knew that he'd done it, What made matters worse is that the story then came out that Squires had gone to Harry D. Reed, who was one of the principals of the Reed Company, and asked him if he would deny that he'd paid $5,000 to him, which Reed refused to do. But he wanted to cover it up that way. I just want to go back a little bit to when he was at the Methodist College. In his diary, there's a little entry that kind of gave me a little indication of his morality and his ethics. He was caught one night on the floor of the girls' rooms, okay, which weren't allowed to do. The boys' rooms were on the second floor, girls' rooms were on the third floor in the boarding house for the out-of-town students. And being caught on the girls' floor, there was a fine involved. Anyway, he was caught, and the matron of the house said, well, it's the first time, so I won't fine you this time. And Squires wrote in his diary, not first occurrence, but first time caught. As if to say, it's only a crime if you're caught doing it.
Wow.
That was the impression I got, the way that he wrote it,
That really does
and
speak
it
volumes,
did nag at me a little bit. I really liked him up to then, and then I'm thinking,
we don't have very much time left, Ted, but I just wanted to clue up with one quick question. He and Lady Squires, Helena, they lived pretty high on the hog, didn't they?
Well, they certainly did. I mean, they would be considered jet setters if the word had been invented at the time. There's no question. They traveled a lot. They traveled extensively. Much of it was on government business, so-called, when he was Prime Minister. But they did have enough of an income that they could fund travel almost every winter. They would leave in January and go to Montreal, Toronto. New York was a favorite place that they'd visit. And they would catch up on the latest styles. They'd go to the opera, they'd go to the theater, they'd do all the things that you do in a large city.
We'll leave it there, Ted. And folks, I have to tell you, there's lots more in this book, Mischief in High Places, about Sir Richard Squires, by my guest today, Ted Rowe. Thanks so much for being on the program, Ted.
It was a pleasure, Karl. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll see you next time.